Well, good morning or good afternoon, just with our Christ Baptist Church family. And we're starting devotions here this week during our shutdown or our lockdown. As I said last week, we'll start the book of Daniel. And so we're in the book of Daniel, and I trust that those of you who are joining us have at least read or maybe scanned the first chapter of the book. I said we'd be going over the first chapter today. And this will be very helpful to us, I believe, the book of Daniel. And why is that? Well, Daniel is an interesting book in that it is listed in the Old Testament under the books of the prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, all these prophets who prophesied about Israel and prophesied to try to correct the nation and where they're going. Daniel is listed in that as one of the prophets, but interesting, as Daniel is called a prophet, in the entire book there is no phrase, "Thus saith the Lord." There is no proclamation that he is giving to his people. There's no saying, you need to return or you need to repent. There's none of that in the entire book. But yet it's God's prophet there that is writing to us. And another thing that's interesting is it's not a prophecy that is really about Israel or Judah or Jerusalem. It's a prophecy about the whole world. A prophecy that is given as we get into the later chapters of what God's plan is going to be for everybody. And he actually gives a very detailed plan in chapter 11 about which kings are going to defeat which other kings, and none of them are Jewish. It goes through the whole world at that time that was known by Daniel about what's important. And so it's a good picture of what God's plan is. And the other point is it's also about a young man who was taken out of his circumstances of comfort, put into very difficult circumstances that he didn't cause, and he had to live under these new circumstances, under this change, under this uncertain world. He lost all his wealth, he lost all his security, and he had to learn an entirely new culture and had to determine whether that was going to be going against his God or not. And he realized that it's actually his God that put him in that situation. And so that's why Daniel is a very helpful book for us to learn about what it is to live under trying times. Now, as we take a look at the book of Daniel, we can see that the first 5 chapters really, first 6 chapters are broken up into historical accounts of what's happening in the life of Daniel. So in the first 6 chapters, we're going to see historically what's going on with Daniel as he was taken captive and what happened in his life during that time. Chapters 7 on through 12 give us an account of prophecy after prophecy after prophecy about what's going to happen after Daniel. And so we see that. Now we do see some prophecies mixed in the first 6 chapters, and we do see some history mixed in the last 6 chapters as well. But that's generally how the book breaks. So there's historical things going on in the first 6 chapters, and guys are talking to each other, and then we start with chapter 7, and Daniel has a vision and a dream with all kinds of pictures and figures of speech, and we'll take a look at those. And for now, we just start with Daniel, who is a young Jewish boy who is taken captive out of his family and has to deal with the situation. And so I'll explain some of these things and try to not drag it out, but just give you some level of explanation as you follow along in your Bibles as we take a look at this, and help us understand what the Lord has for us in the book of Daniel. Well, as we begin, we take a look at the first 7 verses. The first 7 verses really are describing the context, the background, how Daniel got where he is, that kind of thing. Now let's just start with this as you go and we get into verse 1. We understand that Daniel is about 15 years or so old when he was taken captive. And how do I know that he was only 15 and maybe not 35? Well, one thing we know historically is we get toward the last part of Daniel, especially Daniel chapters 9 and 10, we have some specific phrases there that date the time that is, and that dating is about 68 years or so after Daniel was taken captive. Close to 70 years. We know that Daniel was in Babylon for 70 years because that's what Jeremiah prophesied. And so somewhere between 68 and 70 years was the time Daniel was in Babylon before there was a need to move back to Israel. Well, if that's the case, how old was he when he was taken captive? Well, he was in Babylon at least 70 years. We know he wasn't taken captive when he was a baby because he's interacting with the king's court and they're teaching him things and he's learning languages and those kinds of things. So he would have had to have been at least in junior high or high school age, according to chapter 1. Well, in that, he had to have been close to his 80s when he was at the very end. So that's how we understand how Daniel is in his age. And sometimes we see Sunday school pictures of Daniel in the lion's den when he was maybe a child or a young man. That's not true. He was actually about 80 years old when he was in the lion's den. And so we'll take a look here now at Daniel, knowing that he's about 15 years old when these things are happening. Let's read here the first 7 verses. We'll walk our way through this, beginning in chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Stop there for a moment. Just a couple of observations. First, we see the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. A couple things to observe on that. Jehoiakim is the son of Josiah. What do we know about Josiah? He was a very, very good king. He had the best Passover ever in the history of the nation. He turned the nation back he turned the nation back to God. And he was killed in a battle with the king of Egypt. He shouldn't have gone, but he did. And as it happened, then eventually Jehoiakim, his son, became king of Judah. He was king not for very long. And in his 3rd year, actually, there was a king just before him. It was Josiah's first son, who was only king for 3 months, and Egypt took him away and put Jehoiakim in charge for 3 years. And in his 3rd year, here comes Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon that was going after Egypt and pretty much captured all of Egypt and everything Egypt owned. Well, Egypt was currently owning Jerusalem. So naturally, Nebuchadnezzar took over Jerusalem as well. And so he came in and he came up to Jerusalem and besieged it. And verse 2 tells us something very interesting. Look at the words. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. It does not say the king of Babylon defeated Jehoiakim. It doesn't say the king of Babylon took over and defeated Israel. It says the Lord gave Israel into his hand. What this means is that God is never defeated. God wasn't defeated. Even when his vessels and special things for offering, even they were taken out of the house of God and brought to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, that doesn't mean God is defeated, and it doesn't mean God is defiled. It means this is God's plan. God said, to fulfill the prophecy of Jeremiah, here it comes. I'm now bringing the Babylonians to take you away and to take all of my sanctified vessels away as well. So that little phrase is there to help us understand God's not defeated, he's never defeated. So just when you think the wrong army is winning, God's not defeated. Or the wrong political party gets elected into office, God's not defeated. It's not like God's will is being defeated in any way. No, this is God's plan. And they brought the vessels to a place called Shinar, which we know from Genesis 11 is the place where the Tower of Babel was constructed so many generations ago. So that's got to be a pretty humiliating thing, to have all of the items in the temple of God go back to the Tower of Babel. But that was God's plan. And we see here in verses 3 then to 7, the king, after probably a 3 or 4 month journey, going from Jerusalem to Babylon, taking all these prisoners, but it wasn't everybody. It was only certain people. Notice verse 3. Some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles. That's what we know. It's just some people, specifically influential people, people who could be diplomats, people who could be translators, those kinds of people that would be useful to the king. He took with him over about a 3 month journey to Babylon. Then we see here descriptions of them, very specifically, youths in whom was no defect, good looking, intelligence. They had the ability to pass an interview, and they looked good, they spoke good, and they learned well. They passed all the king's tests so that they would want them to be able to serve in the king's court. That's what it says in verse 4. They had the ability for serving in the king's court. Now, as part of the training, verse 5, 6, and 7 tell us that the king appointed for them a specific ration of food, a specific diet. They had to eat the king's food because the king thought it was all wise that they would eat specifically what the king had and the king's wine. And they had, no doubt, various foods there that were actually forbidden by the law of Moses. But the king of Babylon doesn't care about the law of Moses, and he's got his own plan. So he says they're going to be educated for 3 years, it says in verse 5. And after that, they graduate and go to the king's personal service as diplomats, translators, teachers, whatever it might be. Now, verse 6 introduces the story. Among them, among the sons of Judah here, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, 4 young men who knew each other. Just says, out of all the people, I'm going to single out 4 men. And they'll figure prominently in the book of Daniel. And then we get to verse 8. Verse 8 is our theme of the whole chapter. Verse 8 is what we single out here to take a look. And we see here, this is the one thing you want to do when you're in uncertain times, when your future is uncertain, your health might be uncertain. God has done a radical thing. We can say in the last 30 days, God has done a radical thing in the world, not just in South Africa, in the world. God has done a radical thing. He shut down all airline traffic in the world. Maybe not all, but I know that nobody can get a flight to South Africa today. It happened like in 9/11, when airplanes flew into the UN buildings there, the World Trade Center buildings, and blew up these large skyscrapers in the middle of downtown New York City. They shut down air traffic for 3 days. There was not a plane in the sky for 3 days. Everybody was wondering, everybody in the country was wondering what's going to be happening. Security was an issue, and we're looking at everybody funny. How about now we shut down all air traffic around the world? People can't move in borders throughout. The United States is even talking about quarantining some states from other states. That would be like Mpumalanga saying nobody from Limpopo could cross the border. I mean, that's radical change that's taken place. God has certainly done that here with a virus that you cannot detect until after you've had it for maybe 10 days. That's pretty frightening. A virus that we don't even know how much it kills. It might kill 4%, it might kill 10%, it might kill 25%. We don't know. What do you do when you're in that kind of situation? Verse 8. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with wine which he drank. You see, the issue is not your circumstances. The issue is whether you defile yourself. That's the issue. Daniel made up his mind that he wouldn't do that. And in the rest of the chapter, it talks about the results of what happens after Daniel made up his mind. So in Daniel making up his mind for this, I've picked out there's 4, I guess you could say these are characteristics, these are things that happen when you make up your mind. When you actually make up your mind to do something, there's a way to do it. There's a way not to do it, and there's a way to do it. There's a way to be successful. Sometimes we make up our mind, like New Year's resolutions. I'm going to do this, and then after a few days, we give it up. We don't do it anymore. Well, Daniel made up his mind, and he followed through with a plan that enabled him to be successful in his commitment. And specifically, what he made up his mind to do is that he would not defile himself, specifically with the king's choice food or the wine which he drank. So he's not going to defile himself by going against what he knew to be God's word, the law of Moses on what you eat and what you don't eat. Well, we can see here, the first thing that he did was right there in the same verse, verse 8. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. See, he asked. So what's the first thing when you make up your mind? Well, you don't create a fight and go fight with everybody. I made up my mind, so I'm not going to agree with you on anything. No, he honored those in authority. You see what he did in verse 8? He honored those in authority. He sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. You know, they might agree with you. You make up your mind, doesn't mean you're going to fight with everybody, doesn't mean everybody is bad, at least from a human standpoint. And you know, by him honoring his officials, by him honoring the people in charge, look what verse 9 tells us. God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. You see, that's what we also need to understand, is that when you have people that accept a contract you give, you have people that treat you nicely, people that don't. It's God giving you favor. It's God bringing that to happen. It's not because you're so wonderful. God grants favor. And so by Daniel doing this, God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander and the officials. And so what happens then? Well, verse 10, the commander appreciated what Daniel said. He said, look, Daniel, here's my problem. I'm afraid of my lord the king, who's appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. You see, he's got a practical problem. It's not like he's against Daniel's God or he's against Daniel's law. He's saying, look, the king specified that you eat this food so that you will be very healthy, you'll be very intelligent, you'll be very productive for his service. Why would I have you do something that is actually to the king's detriment? I appreciate your conviction to obey your God, but my conviction is I've got to obey my king. And you're actually wanting yourself to hurt the king. So you know what Daniel does? This is number 2. He provides a reasonable compromise. The first is he honored those in authority. Second, he provides a reasonable compromise. You know, this is something you can do. So verse 11 and 12 says, Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So after these people, he talked to the overseer and he said, look, okay, here's a compromise. Please test your servants for 10 days and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. So just 10 days, that's all I'm asking. 10 days, I'm not asking for the moon here. 10 days and we eat, here's what Moses specifies. And he says, you'll let everybody else eat the king's food. 10 days is not going to be much of a deal. We're talking about a 3-year training program here. Give me 10 days to test God's law against man's law. So he provides a reasonable compromise. And after this compromise, you know what he has to do? Thirdly, what he has to do is he has to trust in God's reasoning. He trusts in God's reasoning. Verse 13. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. Notice he's saying, I'm trusting God here that his law is actually beneficial for his people. His law is not going to make us hurt the king. He said, 10 days, we eat what Moses says. Let our appearance be observed in your presence. Then we go before you, and you be the judge. We believe there'll be enough distinction, because God is trustworthy. There'll be enough distinction that will allow you to make a reasonable choice about whether you eat Moses' food or the king's food, whether you have us do that. So he trusted God's reasoning, that it wasn't illogical. So he says, let our appearance be observed in your presence. Compares to the youths who are eating the king's choice food. And notice what he says here in verse 13. And deal with your servants according to what you see. And then you'll be the judge. And you know what? I submit myself to your authority. Because I'm trusting God here. So you know what the commander did in verse 14? He listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. He did it because Daniel honored him, presented a reasonable compromise, and trusted God for the results. So, well, we see it, verse 15, at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better than they were fatter, and they were fatter than all the youths. I don't think that word actually means fatter, like they were, oh man, their pants don't fit. But I think what this is saying is they had more color to their flesh and more tone to their skin. They seem to have more muscle definition and that kind of thing. That's just our English translation of the Hebrew here. So they seemed better. They're fatter than all the youths who've been eating the king's choice food. No doubt the king's food was probably a bit greasy, and some of those guys probably had a long night. But when you eat vegetables and water, it seems like your constitution seems to be probably a lot better. So they were better, so the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink and kept giving them vegetables. See, the world is not stupid. The world will always seek what benefits it. And so when they saw that the law of God, Moses and his food, actually made the people who followed the laws of God more healthy, of course we're going to go with that. So he kept on with the plan because it worked. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food, gave them the vegetables. And as for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. You know, as they're healthy and they're going, now they're trusting God in this. And again, it's God gave them knowledge, God gave them intelligence, and not only that, in every branch of literature. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. And at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting him, that's 3 years, at the end of those days, the commander gladly presented Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the king. And here's the 4th point that I want you to see, right here, coming out of verses 17 and 18. Daniel made up his mind to obey the law of God, but you know what he didn't do? He did not reject the Babylonian culture altogether and say, you guys are pagan, I'm separating myself from you, I refuse to submit to the king, I refuse to do any of this, I'm standing outside. No, he didn't do any of that. He said, I will obey the law of Moses and serve you to the best of my abilities because God put me under you. And so he was a very excellent student as God opened up his mind for intelligence, knowledge, in every kind of literature, every kind of wisdom. So Daniel could interpret multiple languages. He knew science, he knew astrology, he knew all the things that they taught. Even you'll find later in some of the chapters, he even understood their magicians, their magic arts. He understood how they did what they did, what powders would do, and how to look at signs in the sky, and those kinds of things. He didn't reject their culture, saying, I refuse to accept people outside of Jewish culture. He didn't do that. He went ahead and submitted to the authority because it did not defy actual teachings of Moses, so he went ahead and accepted it. He was not going against his God. So as best he could, he didn't want to go against his God and didn't want to go against his king. He accepted the rule that God had given him. And so then, verse 19, the king talks with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, meaning Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. No one was found like them. All 4 were so far superior. Notice verse 20. Every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, in every test, every part of their matric exam, they were 10 times better. 10 times. That's like the others hadn't even begun yet. 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. So it's, how about this? It's not 10 times better than the other captives. It doesn't say that. Look what it says. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them in verse 20, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. You thought it was just better than his class. How would you like to take a matric exam and get such distinction in every part of the exam that you found that you're actually better than every varsity graduate and PhD student in the country? Not just 10 times better than the matric students you with. That's how much God blessed them. And we see here that because of this, verse 21, and Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. That is pretty much 70 years later. So he continued on for the next 70 years. This tells us then how to succeed in making up your mind to obey God in pretty much a godless culture, or a culture that's going against some things that you're wanting to hold to. How do you exist in a culture, in a situation that makes it very difficult? Make up your mind to obey the law of God. Well, what we saw here is you honor those in authority. You try to provide a reasonable compromise so that you can continue to move and see what's in their interest for you. You trust God's reasoning for why his law says what it says. And you don't reject culture altogether. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You do that, you'll make up your mind and you will stick with it. That's one of the things we can learn right out here is what Daniel did. A young man who was trapped, never to be able to go back to his own culture. As far as we know, he never saw Israel again. But with great joy, he could serve his God in a difficult circumstance, in a difficult time. That's what we learn out of the first chapter out of the book of Daniel. And I hope you join us tomorrow as we look into chapter 2, a little bit longer chapter. I don't know if we'll be able to get the whole chapter in, but we'll take a look and see where we go with Daniel chapter 2 tomorrow. God bless.